This is the 5-minute guide to the North Carolina class battleships of the United States Navy.
In the aftermath of the Washington Naval Treaty and subsequently the London Naval Treaty, battleships had been restricted in design specifications, the two primary issues being that displacement was limited to 35,000 tons and guns to 14-inch caliber. This, along with a building holiday, meant that in the 1930s the major navies of the world were looking at new so-called treaty battleships, trying to extract a viable combat unit that wouldn't be at a serious disadvantage against a Colorado, Nagato, or Nelson class from the restricted perimeters they had to operate in. The United States Navy would start their efforts with three designs. Of the three, only Design A actually stuck to the treaty limits, with a 32,000-ton displacement, 30-knot speed, armor against 14-inch shells, and 9 14-inch guns in triple turrets, arranged almost exactly like the Nelson class. Designs B and C were both 1,000 tons over the weight limit, and both had a pair of turrets forward and a pair aft, and were fractionally faster than the A design. B used triple 14-inch turrets for a total of 12 guns, while C used twin 16-inch turrets, in violation of the treaty, for 8 guns. Complicating matters, the Bureau of Ordnance introduced a super heavy 16-inch shell, presumably for the Colorados, and trying to increase armor protection to deal with this threat put Design A very close to the limit, whilst B and C were now nearly 5,000 tons overweight. The next wave of designs relaxed the requirements for battlecruiser-like speeds. 5 designs were presented. D and E attempted fast battleships with 16-inch guns and armor against the same, but were somewhat predictably absurdly over the limit. F was an early attempt at a hybrid battle carrier with a flight deck forward and 8 14-inch guns aft. G and H were slower at 23 knots with 9 14-inch guns and actually came under the weight limits. Basically, the problem was that at 35,000 tons you could look at a list of heavily armed, heavily armored, and fast, and then pick 2, but you were never going to get all 3. A third wave of design followed, with a mixture of fast, slow, lightly, heavily armored, and even quad 14-inch turrets considered. This last scenario was very similar to the King George V penultimate concept. Design K, a ship at just under 35,000 tons with a heavy belt and deck, and 3 quadruple 14-inch turrets, was selected to progress the design. No less than 35 subvariants of this design were then prepared, with Design 16C coming out the winner. This had 3 quadruple 14-inch turrets, a thin 10-inch belt, and 27 knots of speed, with the caveat that a single gun could be traded for a 13.5-inch belt, and another gun could be traded for 30 knots of speed. At this point, however, the Japanese rejected the limits of the London Naval Treaty on gun caliber, which allowed the other powers to invoke an escalator clause to 16-inch guns. This triggered a whole series of arguments over whether America should be seen as the first power to actually break the treaty, as opposed to just reject it, and the ships were ordered with 14-inch weapons, only for the president to change his mind 3 weeks later. Because the North Carolinas were about a year behind the King George V class, they were just about able to make these changes, and the ships would be built with a final armament of 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 super firing forward and 1 aft, 20 dual-purpose 5-inch guns in 10 twin turrets, 5 on each side, and an original anti-aircraft battery of 4 quadruple 1.1-inch guns and 12 50 caliber machine guns. Of course, as time went on, the American all the guns, all the time approach to anti-aircraft weapons would see this initial battery replaced with what eventually would amount to 60 40mm Bofors in 15 quad mounts, and a maximum of 75 20mm Oerlikons in quad, dual, and single mounts. Various radars to find targets and guide the guns would be fitted from 1942 onwards. An inclined 12-inch thick belt, a deck 5 inches thick at the maximum, and a 27-knot top speed completed the overall specifications, albeit that the ships would complete nearly 1,600 tons over the original 35,000-ton displacement limit, and the North Carolina would eventually tip the scales at a grand total of 46,700 long tons at full load after wartime modifications. The 2 ships of the class, North Carolina and Washington, would be built between 1937 and 1941, coming into service with the fleet just either side of the Pearl Harbor attacks and America's entry into the Second World War. North Carolina would spend most of her career as a carrier escort, covering the invasion of Guadalcanal and shooting down about a dozen aircraft at the Battle of Eastern Solomons, before eating a torpedo from the submarine I-19 as part of a salvo that sunk the carrier Wasp and the destroyer O'Brien. The torpedo protection system held just, and with speed limited to 18 knots, the main radar out, and the structure compromised so badly that it was deemed impossible to fire the main guns unless it was a matter of life or death, the ship headed for Pearl Harbor for repairs. She would then go back to carrier escort, mostly for the USS Enterprise, with occasional forays into shore bombardment, seeing action in various well-known locations, including, but not limited to, Tarawa, Truk, Saipan, Guam, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, during which time she was hit by a rather unfriendly, but theoretically friendly, 5-inch shell. After the obligatory stint as part of Operation Magic Carpet, she would be decommissioned in 1947, held in reserve until 1960, and turned into a museum ship in Wilmington. Washington, by contrast, ended up being sent to join the British Home Fleet, carelessly losing its admiral along the way in rough seas. Her tasks in this theatre started out with Arctic convoy escort, taking minimal hull damage but lots of instrumental damage when the King George V accidentally rammed and sank a destroyer whose depth charges cooked off just as Washington passed over the site. In mid-1942 she would make the journey back across the Atlantic to join the Pacific Campaign and was dispatched to the Guadalcanal area. She was with the battleship South Dakota when the latter was engaged by the Congo-class Kirishima and begun to suffer a battering as its electronics promptly failed, leaving it helpless. In the frenzy, however, Washington remained unseen, snuck up to point-blank range, and blasted Kirishima into a flaming ruin. Then it was back to a mixture of escort and bombardment duty, livened up by ramming the battleship USS Indiana in thick fog. Her last wartime mission would be bombarding Okinawa before heading for a refit that lasted past the end of the war. Like her sister, she would be decommissioned into reserve in 1947 and then taken out of service completely in 1960, only in this case to the scrapyard instead of a museum.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below.